feel like I've been around the block, ripping up fantasy stock, working around the clock. Look at the view from the top. Researching rookies a lot? No, I just be listening to pods, yeah. One in particular, I'm just a messenger, let me just pass on the rock. Browning, brunning, pruning, pronouncing ain't what he's doing. What he's doing is not losing, but infusing you with new things. And there's Dennis the Bennett, yeah. The man is a menace, yeah. Building a dynasty, some of the finest things. Promise you, you won't regret it. Sly as a fox, cultured in pop. Give him his props. Here is a thought, here is a box. And you cannot compare them at all, so don't even try. Careful with the news, but when you use a take, I take up Tony Fire. I mean Dyer, because anyone else is a huge mistake. Whoa, fantasy round table, fantasy round table, yeah. Fantasy round table, come take a look at the crown, baby. Hey, fantasy round table, fantasy round table, woo. Fantasy round table, come take a look at the crown, baby. Go.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Fantasy Football Roundtable Podcast. It is Tuesday, July 8th. We are back and we are on a roll. Going to be continuing through our divisional previews. We picked up the NFC North to kick things off before in between vacation stops from me and Dennis, but now we are both back. And the football season is getting closer and closer. Training camp's just a couple weeks away. Some people are starting drafts. So that should be a lot of fun. But before we dive into that, a little bit of news. Dennis, Aaron Rodgers finally broke his weight and signed with the Steelers. Shortly after our last episode, talking to Pat McAfee, gave a suggestion that he thought this might be his final season. Do you believe it?
I do, from the perspective of I know the mind is like, well, you think you can get one more out of it. Let's go one more. You're, when you're at that level, you're an ultimate competitor. But I don't think he wants to keep chasing from team to team to team. So I think if he plays another year, I think he's going to want to stay in Pittsburgh and hopefully they're doing well. But I don't know. I'm so tired of the Aaron Rodgers saga.
I know. I'd be glad if he was out too. Somebody we know will not be playing, at least to start the season, is Justin Tucker. Though some of the legal process is still playing out, the NFL went ahead and gave him a 10-game suspension. He is not currently signed on a roster, but they clarified that the 10-game suspension will be the first 10 weeks of the season regardless. I guess I didn't realize this was the case. I always thought it was 10 weeks from the time you were actually signed on a team, but he could basically sit out the first 10 weeks of the season, and then he's good to go signing with a team.
Yeah, I've seen that happen before, and it doesn't feel like there's, a ton of rhyme or reason when they're like, oh, well, the suspension starts when from the time you're signed, and now this was like, oh. And I don't know if that's because they've already released him now and stuff's going on. And so they're like, well, it's going to be 10 games from now since you're not with a team versus if he was with a team. I don't know the logistics of it and whatnot. I know he wasn't as good last year. And so maybe,
and he's getting older.
We've seen it with, not just football players when they stop being pervy McGurvy, but, Tiger Woods chasing Waffle House waitresses and getting caught and then having his little car accident has never been the same since. It just seems like it falls apart when have to, when that secret gets exposed. Now here's Tucker. There was all this stuff starting to come out and he was having a bad year. And well, I suspect that if somebody signs him in week 9, in week 11, he's probably going on the commissioner's exempt list.
Yeah, we'll have to see. Definitely interesting. The last bit of news that happened is Pittsburgh and Miami just doing a lot of manipulating of their rosters. The Dolphins and the Steelers engaged in a trade between themselves. The long and the short of it is Jalen Ramsey, the corner, and Jonnu Smith, the tight end, go to the Steelers. Minka Fitzpatrick going to the Dolphins, a safety. Then the Dolphins turned around and traded with the Giants for the rights to Darren Waller, who said he is now coming out of retirement to play for them. So, interesting situation. I don't know how I feel about this really for either team. Darren Waller wasn't great his last year that he was playing for the Giants. Also struggled through some injuries. Maybe he got better. Jonnu Smith seemed to be a perfect fit in that Miami offense. I don't know what Miami is doing in general. Pittsburgh making moves, talking about how they're focused on a championship, but still can't seem to work things out with TJ Watt, who would seem to be the most important player on their roster. So are either of these teams better?
I think Minka is probably better than Jalen, but how much better? They've both been around a little while, especially Jalen. Jonnu Smith, it was one of those perfect storm Gary Barnage kind of seasons where everything just lines up and you have put up these monster numbers. Can it be repeated? I've seen a lot of talk tying him to Arthur Smith and Arthur Smith loves him and yada yada yada, but in reality he only averages like 42 catches and 480 yards per season with Arthur Smith. So that isn't like high-end fantasy football production. So and then you still have Freiermuth. Now I get it, all they have pretty much is DK Metcalf until Roman Wilson or Calvin Austin or is Van Jefferson there? No, who is it?
No, Van Jefferson. Robert Woods is
Robert Woods is there.
That's the thing. They need a wide receiver, and they went and got another tight end.
Maybe they're going to put Darnell Washington out wide and make him be a matchup nightmare.
Maybe they're going to put Jonnu out wide. I mean, it also people feeling hopeful that Jaylen Warren was going to be involved in the passing game. I think it gets even muddier if you're hoping for like fantasy upside from a running back, but now you have not only one, but two tight ends. What they don't have is anybody, other than DK Metcalf potentially to go down the field unless,
and to be fair,
Calvin Austin works.
That's what DK does really well. He runs fast.
But honestly, if you are a defense and you're looking at this, I'm not feeling that, right? And the other thing that makes me laugh is, aside from one pretty good year from Robert Tonyan and a couple spotty years in other places, Rodgers hasn't been a huge tight end guy.
He has not.
So, we shall see. Well, it's a good segue because we're looking at the AFC North, so we'll get to the Pittsburgh Steelers in a minute. Going in order, as we did before, we're looking at all four teams in order of their 2024 finish. The number one team last year was the Baltimore Ravens. They finished 12-5. Among their losses, quarterback Josh Johnson moved on, wide receiver Deontay Johnson moved on, and cornerback Tre'Davious White is off the roster. They picked up Cooper Rush from the Cowboys to be their new backup quarterback. They signed DeAndre Hopkins, who was with the Titans and the Chiefs last year, to sit at wide receiver with them, and they brought in Jair Alexander, a great corner from the Green Bay Packers, to kind of fill that secondary. So some pretty good. I would say that in all three phases, that feels like an upgrade over positions they had open. Fantasy finishes from last year: Lamar Jackson finished as QB1, Derrick Henry, pretty outstanding season coming over, finished as RB4. Justice Hill ended up as RB37, pretty usable on a week-to-week basis, kind of in that flex role, more the pass catching back for them. Zay Flowers was their best wide receiver at wide receiver 25. Rashad Bateman was wide receiver 40. DeAndre Hopkins was wide receiver 49 between the two teams he played for last year. Meanwhile, Mark Andrews, tight end 6, Isaiah Likely, tight end 16. What are we expecting from this offense?
I'm expecting more of the same. It's not broke. They love the pieces that they have. I know Zay Flowers got banged up last year, but Rashad Bateman signed another extension, and he's established himself as their 1B to Zay Flowers. I wouldn't have thought it the way things started for him. Now, granted, they don't have the highest passing volume. They've got very productive tight ends that siphon off a good amount of targets. We've just come to expect that's what they do. And then they've added Derrick Henry. It's a prolific offense, scores a lot of points, but with Lamar Jackson's rushing, and currently his ADP is 103. I don't see any reason why you wouldn't take him there. He's still young enough. Even in Dynasty, I think he's still a very, very high draft pick just because he's so established in that offense. Henry, his ADP is a little bit lower. This is Dynasty Nerds mock draft ADP, and they've done a ton of them. So they're, Derrick Henry was going at pick 48. That's end of the fourth round. In Dynasty, that makes a lot of sense. But like in redraft, I think Henry's going to be probably a top 18 pick. He's getting the volume. There is no running back on that roster that is a threat to his volume. They do bring Justice Hill in as a change of pace, and there's a lot of conversations out there about things like handcuffing, and they don't handcuff. There's not a handcuff on that team to Derrick Henry. If Henry gets injured, there's no running back that's just going to step in and take his role. It'll be Justice Hill and somebody else. I forget who else is on their depth chart, but
they have Keaton Mitchell, Rasheen Ali.
Yep. And so they'll split all of those touches, and Lamar will probably run a little more than he does with Derrick Henry in there. So I'm really good with kind of where they're going. If I'm, when you're doing a dynasty startup, you have to make a decision like, am I trying to win year one, or am I trying to rebuild? And it's been in vogue for a long time to try to build a team of young players. Well, when you have, 11 other people drafted, it's not like you can get all the early picks. Zay Flowers, his ADP is 66. So what's that? 6th round. I think that's a reasonable ADP. I think Rashad Bateman is the better value, though. He's going to pick 166. He's 100 picks later. And Bateman was wide receiver 40 to Zay Flowers, wide receiver 25 last year. Now, I get it. Flowers did battle some injuries.
It was really because of tight end because of touchdowns. Only 45 receptions for Bateman, but he got 9 touchdowns, 74 receptions, 116 targets for Flowers, but only 4 times in the end zone.
And I think that's the role that Bateman plays. He's bigger than Flowers. He's kind of that red zone target that's not a tight end.
Yeah, so I think for me, I still, if we're talking about 2025, I think Lamar Jackson, top 12, probably top 5 option at quarterback, unless a catastrophic injury happens. Derrick Henry is definitely a top 10 option for me at running back, even in PPR, where he's not going to be a big factor. Zay Flowers is the receiver that I prefer, and I think that, high-end wide receiver 3, maybe squeaks out a wide receiver 2, is probably right about right for him. My question is what happens to the rest of the assets when it comes to passing. So what really benefited Justice Hill, he saw 51 targets, caught 42 passes. Likely saw 58 targets, caught 42 passes. 69 targets for Mark Andrews. He caught 55 passes and 11 touchdowns. 72 targets for Bateman, 45 receptions, 9 touchdowns. But their wide receiver 3 last year was Nelson Aguilar, and he only saw 29 targets. I think DeAndre Hopkins, his targets are going to come from a mixture of siphoning off from Hill, likely Bateman, and Andrews. And the thing that we've seen about an aging DeAndre Hopkins, what you said, Bateman's role, he's bigger, he's a red zone target. That is precisely what we've seen from DeAndre Hopkins in his stints with Kansas City and with Tennessee. He was more of a factor down there in the red zone. So if you siphon off some of the touchdowns and you siphon off some of the targets, that's where I start to wonder. You look at those finishes from last year, and they have that core returning. And if you took out Hopkins, you have basically a running back 1, a almost running back 3 there in PPR. You have a high end wide receiver 3. You have a wide receiver 4. You have a tight end 1 and a tight end 2. I think a couple of those guys, then regress back. So does Bateman end up more, on the cusp of wide receiver 5, and Hopkins ending up in wide receiver 5-6 territory, and maybe Andrews lower as a tight end 1, and maybe Likely and Hill not getting as much volume coming back, because I think honestly a healthy Mark Andrews and the presence of Hopkins could hurt Likely the most.
Yeah, I want to buy into the presence of Hopkins, but it just feels like that he's running out of gas there. He's in that Charles Barkley chasing a ring mode right now. And while he does provide some value and some leadership, what his skill set is he's a tight end in a wide receiver body. He's not fast. It's all contested catch kind of stuff. And while he's very good at it, and he still gets open pretty good, I think that I'm not 100% sold that he's going to siphon off a lot of targets.
All right. Well, Rashad Bateman last year saw 72 targets, caught 45 for 756 and 9 touchdowns. DeAndre Hopkins last year, between his two teams, saw 80 targets, caught 56 for 610 and 5 touchdowns. I mean, they're not that far apart, and he had some big games for Kansas City and some important games, and Likely 58 targets, caught 42 for 477 and 6 touchdowns. A lot of these guys really got boosted by touchdowns. If you siphon off a few touchdowns, and last year Aguilar had 29 targets. Let's say DeAndre Hopkins only gets 50 targets or 55 or 60 targets. That's still pulling 20 or 30 targets. They are not a huge target-rich offense, or haven't been. They were not a huge passing offense. Lamar Jackson threw it 474 times last year and only had 4,172 yards passing. They are a big rushing offense that then goes into throw. And I don't think Flowers is going to come back significantly. He saw 116 targets. He seems to be well clear of everybody else. I think it's those guys that were fighting in the 50, 60, 70 target range that are going to ebb down. And I think touchdowns would be the biggest. Rashad Bateman was wide receiver 40 because he caught 9 touchdowns, which is pretty impressive. Mark Andrews, even though he was splitting time at tight end and missed some time and had some rough games, caught 11 touchdowns. So that's what would make me – I would still bet on – if I was betting on pieces, I'm more confident in Andrews for one more year, Flowers, Henry, and Jackson. But I do think Hopkins has the potential to take a little bit away from, Bateman and Likely and Hill, which might make them go from these are guys I'm excited to throw in my roster. Or if you start 3 receivers and have 3 flexes that you're playing to, that's not quite as dynamic for me. And I'm looking for a better situation, because I didn't start the season having Bateman in, but he had so many games where he only caught a few passes, but he got a touchdown or he got a big score, that then you started throwing him in your lineup. And at wide receiver 40, you're probably definitely starting him somewhere in the week. If he ends up around wide receiver 50, is that as exciting, or 55?
Yeah, and I mean, I get it. And from a value perspective, even in Dynasty, Hopkins is going 90 picks after Bateman, who's going 100 picks after Flowers. And there's definitely some merit to the buy the cheapest guy, which would be Hopkins. I'm curious. It'll be interesting to see where redraft ADP comes in when that gets underway, when it comes to these 3 receivers. are people going to buy more into your he's going to siphon those targets off?
Well, and at first I dismissed Hopkins too, but then I started looking at the numbers and looking at the kind of margins that they have. And it's not like, Bateman was a 100 target guy getting in there. He was, made the most of the targets he got. There was not a whole lot of, and they just really didn't have a number 3 receiver. And you have to wonder, does that goose up something like Bateman and Likely and Hill's targets to a level where you're more excited? Because we didn't start last year, or at least I didn't, thinking Justice Hill was going to be a guy I'd be interested in flexing or starting in running back desperation spots, but he ended up becoming that. Does he remain that? He's not a big runner, and absent a Derrick Henry injury, he's probably not going to be that, but he saw 50 plus targets and caught more than 40 passes. So for PPR, that was pretty good. But does that, start to go away if you have other targets? That's the part that makes me a little bit nervous with them. The number 2 team, a team that has made so many changes, is the Pittsburgh Steelers. They finished 10-7. They made it into the playoffs, didn't last long. Quarterback Russell Wilson now with the Giants. Quarterback Justin Fields now with the Jets. Running back Najee Harris now with the Los Angeles Chargers. Wide receiver Van Jefferson now with the Tennessee Titans. Wide receiver Mike Williams now with the Chargers. Wide receiver George Pickens traded to the Dallas Cowboys. Safety DeMonte Casey now with the Cleveland Browns. And safety Minka Fitzpatrick was just traded to the Miami Dolphins. They also brought in a bunch of pieces. Aaron Rodgers, formerly of the Jets, is now there. Mason Rudolph, who was with Tennessee last year, comes back. They drafted Will Howard, giving them a completely new quarterback room. They brought in DK Metcalf in trade from the Seattle Seahawks and signed Robert Woods, who was with the Houston Texans last year. They drafted Caleb Johnson out of Iowa in the running back spot. They brought in safety Juan Thornhill and cornerback Jalen Ramsey, and they just traded for Jonnu Smith, who was a pretty strong finisher last year at tight end for Miami. Fantasy finishes: Aaron Rodgers was quarterback 15 for the Jets last year. Mason Rudolph, quarterback 36 in Tennessee. Jaylen Warren, who did remain one of the few offensive contributors that remains in place, was running back 39 for them last year, splitting with Harris. DK Metcalf, only wide receiver 33 last year in Seattle. Calvin Austin, kind of their slot guy, wide receiver 69 last year. And Pat Freiermuth, their other tight end, was tight end 9. I don't know what to make of this offense. They made a whole lot of changes. I don't know if it's better.
It feels like a lot of change for change's sake is what it feels like. And I get it when it comes to getting out of the George Pickens business. It's probably prudent, and Pittsburgh has been better at offloading soon-to-be problematic wide receivers than any team in recent memory. And Pickens, for all the talent he seems to have, has really, been peculiar. That being said, I don't know that you're going to replace his production with Jonnu Smith. Caleb Johnson has the highest ADP from a dynasty perspective at 63. DK Metcalf is at 73. When Metcalf came into the league, there was a lot of talk about, well, he can only do one thing, and that's go deep. And then Seattle said, all right, well, we're just going to have him do that better than every other wide receiver in the league until he gets better at some of the other stuff. And he did. And then he started to get better at some of the other stuff, but he sort of plateaued and didn't take that next step. That's the word I'm looking for. Didn't take that next step into becoming an elite wide receiver. He's still a physical freak with pretty good hands. He's still faster than just about everybody that tries to cover him. Definitely bigger than everybody that tries to cover him. But he has games where he disappears and they just don't seem to be able to get anything out of him. Will that change in Pittsburgh with Aaron Rodgers? It's a great question.
Feels like you could be describing George Pickens from last year, because that was our complaint with him. He disappeared.
Are you freezing or am I freezing?
You're freezing. I feel like that was the complaint from George Pickens, was he just disappeared in games at times too. So that part will be interesting. The other part that kind of makes me laugh is the quarterback situation. So ostensibly, they brought in Aaron Rodgers to greatly improve. But if you actually looked from a fantasy standpoint, Russell Wilson took over as the starter for the Pittsburgh Steelers last year in week 7. From that point on in his starting tenure, he was quarterback 14 for fantasy, averaging 16.2 points per game. Aaron Rodgers during that stretch, quarterback 15, averaging 16.1 points per game. So I don't know that you're getting I don't know that you are just getting a big boost from putting Aaron Rodgers in there, because they had a fairly similar numbers and production during the time they were starters. And Aaron Rodgers had a vastly superior supporting cast with the Jets last year, and probably a better line than what he has here in Pittsburgh. He had 3 decent running backs. In Breece Hall, he had Garrett Wilson and Devontae Adams out there. Tyler Conklin, a pretty capable tight end, a guy he knew, and Alan Lazard, who honestly wasn't that great, but I think might be better than this stage Robert Woods. So he's taken a step back. They gave him basically a 2 tight end offense, which is similar to what Arthur Smith did his last year in Atlanta, which nothing about that, an offense that he ran with Desmond Ridder, really seems to fit with Rodgers. And so those are some of my, Rodgers was a QB2 last year. I guess that would be the hope, that he's a QB2. I know why Caleb Johnson's the most appealing for Dynasty, because they're hoping they're going to run a lot. And I am actually interested in that. Najee Harris, for whatever faults, had 1,000 yards or more in every season he was with Pittsburgh. I don't know how I feel about Jaylen Warren. I don't know how Jonnu Smith and Pat Freiermuth fit together. I think they both may cannibalize each other to the point that neither of them is a tight end one, because if I remember from that season, Jonnu Smith caught 50 passes and Kyle Pitts caught like around 50 passes, but neither of them cracked the top 12, I don't think, at tight end. I'll look it up. But those are the kind of Pittsburgh might be fine fine in the same way they were fine last year from an NFL standpoint, but from a fantasy standpoint, I'm not that excited to watch them.
Yeah, I feel like Aaron Rodgers is a bye week fill-in this year at best. He's going to be a mid to low end QB2, and Jaylen Warren will have a couple games where he catches a few passes to go with some yardage and maybe gives you some hope. DK Metcalf will have a big game here or there. It feels like it's going to be so hit and miss on their way to 9-8 again this year. And as much as I want to give Mike Tomlin credit for that streak, at some point, you got to figure out, like, how are we going to get back to the Super Bowl? You don't want to be that team from an NFL perspective that just either barely makes or barely misses the playoffs and then you're done, because you're not a serious contender. And I don't know that from a real football perspective, DK Metcalf and Caleb Johnson and Aaron Rodgers make them Super Bowl contenders. I do know that Aaron Rodgers probably doesn't make those passing assets high-end fantasy assets, and I probably want Caleb Johnson in redraft over anybody else on this team.
Yeah, so that if you look at that 2023 Atlanta offense, which he seems to be desperate to rebuild there, that was the rookie year for Bijan Robinson. But he had a returning back in Tyler Algier, 214 carries for Bijan, 976 yards, also ended up catching 58 passes, targeted 86 times. Tyler Algier, 186 carries, 683 yards, did not see much in the way of passing game. So, That's interesting. The tight ends, fantasy finishes, Kyle Pitts was tight end 13. Jonnu Smith was tight end 17. Pitts averaging 8.1 points per game. Jonnu Smith, 7.3 points per game. Basically, Kyle Pitts was the kind of number 2 receiver behind. They had one good receiver on that Atlanta team, and it was Drake London. And he saw 110 targets, caught 69 passes for 905 yards and 2 touchdowns. Kyle Pitts was next with 90 targets, 53 receptions, 667 yards. Jonnu Smith, 70 targets, was 4th on the team behind Bijan. 50 receptions, 582 yards. So maybe that is the passing game that he would like to set up, is the 2 tight ends, 1 really good receiver, and a pass catching back, which I would guess to be Jaylen Warren. But that we haven't seen that from Aaron Rodgers, so it kind of makes me wonder, how's Aaron feeling about all this?
I think he's feeling like he was still in the dark.
Well, and if this really is his kind of like swan song, is this the way, he wants to go out? Jonnu Smith was tight end 4 last year, averaged 13.1 points per game. Freiermuth was tight end 9 last year, averaging 9.9 points per game. Both of them used to seeing a full load, but it gets split out more. And are they going to use backs? I think what's going to be frustrating for me, I think, with Pittsburgh is we have not seen Aaron Rodgers really caught into playing in the preseason. So we may still not know what Pittsburgh's offense looks like going into week 1.
You are correct, sir.
I mean, I guess if you have Johnson and Metcalf, you're feeling pretty good. If you were rolling with Freiermuth and you were feeling pretty good, you feel less good. If Jonnu Smith had been your tight end savior last year, you're feeling less good. And I like the teams where I have Aaron Rodgers as my QB3 in Superflex. I feel pretty good about that. The teams where
I
where
think
he's my QB2, I feel a little less
comfortable spot for him.
Well, next up on the docket is a team that, whether they are successful in terms of wins or losses, we know that they are going to be very successful in terms of giving us plenty to feel good about in fantasy, and that is the Cincinnati Bengals. They were only 9-8 last year. They got off to a miserable start, but they had a hot finish and nearly made the playoffs. Khalil Herbert, who they traded for at running back, left and went to the Indianapolis Colts. They lost guard Alex Kappa and defensive tackle Sheldon Rankins. They brought in Samaje Perine, who was with them, then was with Denver, then was with Kansas City, and now is back, kind of filling that third down passing running back depth role. And they brought in linebacker Oren Burks. Fantasy finishes last year, nothing to feel bad about here. Joe Burrow, quarterback 3, Chase Brown, running back 10, and he wasn't even the lead back at the beginning part of the season, so could go even higher. Jamar Chase, hard to be better than wide receiver 1, which is what he finished last year. T. Higgins, despite missing 5 games, still finished as wide receiver 17. Andre Yosevas, wide receiver 68. And Mike Gesicki, who they brought in at tight end, actually finished as tight end 13. They brought all of these guys back on offense. There's still a possibility that Jermaine Burton could develop into something. They've been working on that offensive line. I don't have any questions about their offense. I think it is going to be good as long as those guys are healthy. I think Joe Burrow, for me, is a QB1. Jamar Chase is a wide receiver 1. I think T. Higgins, if he stays healthy, could push to be a low-end wide receiver 1. And I like Yosevas and Gesicki as guys I have on my bench, guys that are must-starts if Higgins misses a game like happened last year. And I like Chase Brown, and I think he's clearly become their number 1 back. They brought in Perine. They still have Zach Moss to back him up, but it doesn't seem like that's a challenge. This is an offense that I think if you have pieces of, you got to be feeling pretty good.
Yeah. They spent the offseason, early part of the offseason, with Joe Burrow basically saying, look, you sons of guns, you bring back T. Higgins. I know you're bringing back Jamar, but I'm telling you, bring back Higgins. And then they re-signed Gesicki first, I think. Gesicki isn't even showing up in Dynasty Nerds ADP. He's thought so highly of.
Well, I mean, he's kind of an end-of-the-bench guy. He's not a tight end I want to have to rely on. But as we saw, he and Andre Yosevas are parts of this offense why they brought him back, and especially if Higgins or Chase misses time. I mean, Higgins only managed 12 games last year.
He did.
And missed parts of some of those 12 games he was in. And we saw Gesicki step up and was actually a viable option even from week one. He should have been given the touchdown that would have beat the Patriots in week one last year, because we saw on review, definitely got it.
So Higgins was buoyed a little bit by touchdowns. He had a career high 10 touchdowns. His numbers weren't necessarily out of line for season long. It was on a per game basis, he was a little better. Let me see. Click my toggle switch here.
Well, that's because
he had
Cincinnati has no defense.
6 receptions. So that was good, but it was really the 10 touchdowns in 14 or 12 games, that buoyed him to that higher finish. So he needs to stay healthy this year. I think Burrow wants to prove himself and the Bengals right by making sure that Chase and Higgins both put up elite numbers this year. And so I would not be surprised to see the two of them push for, if both Higgins and Chase play 17 games, I would not be surprised to see them combine for 275 targets.
Yeah.
I just think they're a pass-first team.
They had more than 275 targets last year.
Well,
Chase had 175 targets, 109 for Higgins.
I didn't realize
they had 284 targets combined last year.
Okay, I say I only have Higgins' number. Again, I'm buoyed by it only being 12 games. That's why I'm looking at the 109 targets, and I'm thinking, oh, if Chase had 140, 150, but no.
Yeah, he had 175.
So maybe 325, 350. How about we go there?
Yeah, I think that's certainly possible. And you're right that would probably come some at the expense of Gesicki and Yosevas, who get a bump. I'm not saying they would be starters for me. They're just guys that, given how good this offense has been and the fact that their defense may be a touch better, but probably not significantly better, which was really the reason that they had to go out there and throw and throw and throw. I mean, Joe Burrow had a magnificent, practically career game in week 3 and lost to the Washington Commanders because his defense couldn't stop a fart in a stiff breeze. So,
and maybe Al Golden fixes that, and Lou Anarumo turns up the heat. And
the big question, I think, if you're watching, if you're previewing Cincinnati, I don't have any questions about their offense other than those guys need to stay healthy, which isn't a question. It's just a prayer. It's the defense, because they haven't figured out to settle the contract dispute with Trey Hendricks or their first-round rookie. And, if you're Al Golden, you're like, well, I inherited this situation, and now you've managed to piss off my two potentially best defensive players, so I'm feeling less bullish.
Well, I did see a blurb on Roto-World today that the Bengals and Hendrickson have started talking again. So let me ask you this. So currently Higgins is going at pick 46, so end of the 4th round. Do you think he outperforms that if he stays healthy all 17 games?
So it's hard to tell when you're just talking about ADP. So what wide receiver position?
Wide receiver 17.
Yes, I have him higher than that.
So, yeah, I think I think if I can get him at wide receiver 17 in a startup, I think that's a steal.
Yeah. The last team in the AFC North was an enigma in 2024, and you know what? They're probably still an enigma, and that is Dennis's beloved Cleveland Browns. They finished in 4th place, 3-14. Jameis Winston at quarterback is now with the New York Giants. Who isn't at this point in time? Dorian Thompson-Robinson, another quarterback, was traded to the Philadelphia Eagles. Nick Chubb, their longtime running back, now with the Houston Texans. Elijah Moore, slot receiver, went to the Buffalo Bills. They brought in a whole bunch of people potentially at quarterback. And mind you, they still have Deshaun Watson, who he says he's going to play. The team says he probably isn't going to play. We know the team doesn't want him to play, but apparently he's mentoring the rookies. So what can possibly go wrong? They also brought in Joe Flacco, veteran. He was their comeback player of the year in 2023, spent last year with the Indianapolis Colts. Kenny Pickett comes over from the Eagles, was once with the Pittsburgh Steelers. They drafted Dylan Gabriel in the 3rd round, Shedeur Sanders in the 5th round. Those are the rookies. They drafted running back Quinshon Judkins in the 2nd round, running back Dylan Sampson in the 4th round, I believe. They brought in wide receiver Deontay Johnson. They added guard Tevin Jenkins, and they brought in safety DeMonte Casey from Pittsburgh Steelers. Fantasy finishes last year. Joe Flacco was quarterback 35, making starts for the Colts. Jerome Ford, their best running back last year, was running back 33, remains on the roster for one more year. Jerry Jeudy, a breakout career year in 2024, despite the dumpster fire around him, was wide receiver 12. Cedric Tillman, some good flashes, but injured a lot, finished as wide receiver 90. And David Njoku finished as tight end 11. Dennis, we have no idea who's going to start at quarterback for the Browns. My best guess would be the Browns don't even know, because depending on which news outlet you go to, any one of the 4 not named Deshaun Watson has been tapped to be the starter to start the season. So that should be a lot of fun. I like Jerry Jeudy. I think the backfield could be interesting, but probably a work in progress. I like David Njoku, but I don't know what to make of the wide receivers, or if Deontay Johnson has anything left. So how are you feeling about this Browns group?
It's I'm trying to be optimistic. So the current ADP has Shedeur Sanders as the first quarterback selected from the Browns pool, and that's at pick 148.
Kind of for dynasty, though, right?
Yeah,
you know, I could see him being a better. If he believed in his future, I could see him being a better dynasty than a sure bet for 2025.
Exactly.
Although that Deshaun Watson mentoring plan has so far yielded, a couple of speeding violations?
A couple big ones. Dylan Gabriel is going to pick 239, Kenny Pickett at 304, and Joe Flacco isn't getting drafted. So, you know, the dynasty community pretty much has it in complete opposite of what I think the aggregate media thinks it'll be. I think most people think that, you know, they're reading into who's getting how many touches. Well, Flacco's played in the system. He knows the system. And I think there's a certain comfort level with Kevin Stefanski that says, I don't need to teach Joe Flacco how to run my system. He knows how to run my system. Whether he can run it at a high enough level, completely different conversation at, you know, what is he, 63 years old now or something? Kenny Pickett, you know, he was a first-round draft pick, and first-round draft picks get additional chances. I don't think he's anything but a career backup. Dylan Gabriel is sort of in that, and Shedeur Sanders, for that matter, are both in that Brock Purdy kind of had so many college starts, like Bo Nix had so many college starts, and there's no substitute for actual getting out on the field and making plays against live fire. And so Gabriel or Sanders, either one could come out of nowhere at any point this season and grab a hold of the starting job. I think that any of these quarterbacks, you're just taking a flyer and you're hoping maybe something pays off. They have a couple good games and you can move them for something of value. Mary Kay Cabot came out today or yesterday, I think it was Mary Kay, Cleveland beat writer, and said that she expected Jerome Ford was going to lead the way to start the season. That would make sense. You know, he's been there for he's going into his 3rd or 4th year now. He's been the starter for most of the last couple years. I think Stefanski values error-free football. And I think the general perception is somebody who's been around for 3 years in my system is a lot less likely to make mistakes than a rookie. That being said, I think the future of the running game is in very good hands in Cleveland with Quinshon Judkins and Dylan Sampson. I expect them to be the duo next year and for the next few seasons anyways. Sans injury, I think they're both going to be very productive backs in Cleveland. Quinshawn is going to pick 52. I think that's a great value. Njoku is the wild card because it depends on who's a quarterback. How productive is he going to be? Elite productive like 2 years ago when Flacco came in. Njoku blew up, man. He just had and he's kind of been riding that wave ever since. Extremely good athlete, big, fast. His hands seem to have gotten better. They brought in Harold Fannin, who is similar in Njoku in size and was super productive in college, but kind of doesn't run real smoothly, even though he's got pretty good speed. And then the wide receiver core could actually be in very good hands, pun intended, as it relates to Jerry Jeudy. Maybe Jeudy solved his hands problem last year, and going forward, he's going to be reliable and be able to show off that Alabama what's the word I'm looking for? Not credential, pedigree, that Alabama pedigree as a wide receiver. Cedric Tillman, he's a big wide receiver with good speed, but he's only had a couple really productive games, but he seems to have shown enough that he's stepping into that other outside role. We've seen Deontay Johnson be really productive in Pittsburgh, and then, they got out of the Deontay Johnson business and he went elsewhere, and lo and behold, he was kind of crazy. He seems to be the odds-on favorite right now to win the slot job in Cleveland. I don't know what that means for volume. I don't know if there will be enough volume to keep him from going crazy. But also, I think he has a good enough track record that the three of those guys could be a very, very productive wide receiver group. I just don't know how much Kevin Stefanski is going to really want to throw the ball.
Well, and that's the thing, though. So Elijah Moore, Jordan Akins, who played significant snaps at tight end, and Amari Cooper, who was there for the first 6 games and was starting for 6 games, are all gone. And between those 3 players, they vacated 213 targets from last year. You figure Tillman hopefully takes a step up, but there are targets available for both Fannin and Deontay Johnson if they can pan out, because David Njoku had 97 targets last year, 145 for Jerry Jeudy. They're returning, maybe Njoku sees a slight tick up, but he had 97 and tight end 2 there had 58. So there is a role for them to have a couple of tight ends. Amari Cooper only there for 6 games, saw 53 targets, and Elijah Moore kind of under the radar, but saw 102 targets, caught 61 passes. So I think there is some room. But the question really comes down to quarterbacks. So let me ask you this, cobbling together the reports. If you're going by reports, people have been enamored that Shedeur Sanders seems to be looked the best in some mini camps. Other beat reporters said that the decision is coming down to Kenny Pickett versus Dillon Gabriel, while yet another report said that the veterans in the locker room prefer Joe Flacco. Does that give you any closer? If you had to say right now today, your best guess for the week 1 starter, who are you going with?
Well, and I also saw yesterday or today that Gabriel and Sanders are basically fighting for the last spot.
And that makes total sense too. They still haven't put Deshaun on injured reserve or the PUP list, which is crazy to me. But I can't imagine they're keeping more than 3 quarterbacks on the active roster.
Yeah, I think that I can see him keeping 4 because they may want to leverage one of the veterans in a trade, like they did with Josh Dobbs. And maybe they go into the season with 2 quarterbacks and they wait to see who needs a backup. Can we move Pickett? One of these rookies is starting to play well. Cleveland led the league. I'm surprised. They actually led the league in pass attempts last year.
Jameis Winston.
But they were 22nd in yards.
Yeah.
So
again, Jameis Winston.
And it's, when I think about that receiving group and that quarterback room, are they more likely to be top 8 in pass attempts again this year and strive to be more efficient maybe? Potentially, they've got a pretty good offensive line. They're doing some rebuilding. I love DeJuan Jones as a Ohio State Buckeye. I'm not 100% sold on him as a left tackle because he, one of the things he was kind of known for here at Ohio State was not being really fleet of foot. At 6'8" and 345 pounds or whatever, he's a big dude. Now it does take a while to get around him. It's like traveling around the Rockies to get to the quarterback there. So, and he's had a little bit of an injury history since he's been to the NFL. But that offensive line is going to need to come together. But if they're going to keep that passing volume up and improve in their efficiency, i.e. more touchdowns, better yardage, more completions, then, I think that bodes well for that team because they've got a lot of pieces on defense. I stack the quarterback room right now. I stack it, Flacco, Pickett, and the rookies. I just think that Kevin Stefanski is super conservative and doesn't want to, especially a 3rd and a 5th round rookie, he doesn't want to thrust them into a situation where they're going to be over their head because we see it all the time when, I've got a quarterback I think that we can develop. Oh, my God, I got to play him. I played him too early, and now he's broken, and I'm getting rid of him. And so I think Stefanski would like to let those 2 guys ride it out on the bench all year.
Yeah, I tend to think the same too, especially looking at the early part of the schedule for the Cleveland Browns. They host the Cincinnati Bengals week 1, and they are at the Baltimore Ravens week 2. Then they're home for the Green Bay Packers and week 3, and then they're at Detroit week 4. I think Flacco is going to be the starter week 1 for them. And if they don't have a very hot start to the season, which certainly seems possible given that they're playing 4 really good teams, 3 playoff teams from last year, then maybe you look at options. Maybe as they get deeper in the season, they look at one of the rookies. But that's too. If I would not also be shocked if the Browns, depending on what happens in training camps or situations, or if New Orleans gets out there and can't stomach their options at quarterback, that you don't see a trade. I think either New York or Cleveland, one of those teams is going to give a veteran quarterback, and honestly, Jameis Winston might be more appealing out of New York, and by all accounts, now that they have Jackson Dart, they're perfectly comfortable keeping Tommy DeVito as number 3 and rolling with Wilson and Dart and letting Winston go now, or Winston or Flacco. I don't know that there would be a huge trade market for Kenny Pickett because we just haven't seen enough success. I don't, if you were a quarterback desperate team or if you were a contender that needed some kind of a bridge quarterback for a few weeks to cover an injury, I don't know that Kenny Pickett's the guy that I'm going for. So let me ask you before we get out of here, how do you feel this division is going to shake out?
I think the top is going to be a battle between the Ravens and the Bengals, and I could see both of those teams making the playoffs. The Bengals really hinge on how well the defense plays because we know they can score points. That being said, I think the Ravens are just too balanced to not win the division. I think they've got a really, really good offense, and I think their defense is pretty good. I think Cincinnati finishes second, and I think I'm going to go Pittsburgh, Cleveland as the bottom two. Neither one. I think Pittsburgh misses the playoffs.
Yeah, that's kind of where I'm at. So I think the big questions for Cincinnati are: can the offense stay healthy? Can they get this off-field stuff settled with their defensive stars? And can they have a better start to a season? They have gotten off to cripplingly slow starts. It was encouraging to have heard them this offseason talking about needing to play some preseason snaps and being ready to go week one. I think Cincinnati has a good roster. I thought they've had a good roster for a couple of years, though, and they had the injury to Joe Burrow, and then Burrow was healthy last year, and their team was just dreadful anyway. So those things scare me, but I think that Pittsburgh, Baltimore, and Cincinnati are all going to finish with winning records, at least 9 wins. I think Pittsburgh has put too much all into it. I'm not sold Pittsburgh is better than a 9 or 10 win team, though, even with all the changes they've made. And I think Baltimore and Cincinnati probably finish higher. Cleveland, there's a range of outcomes. They only won 3 games last year. I think they could be a 5, 6, 7 win team. They could be fun. They have some pieces. They have a good coach, but they don't strike me as particularly competitive. Well, that'll do it for us today. We'll be back later in the week. Our next preview is the NFC West, another kind of loaded and interesting division with a lot of shifting pieces. But Dennis, if people are feeling that summer swoon and they haven't found anything to fill that void, what else can they do to fill that time?
I don't know if it's a swoon or if it's just you're melting. It's so dang hot. Bust out that phone, that computer, go to your favorite podcast platform, hit that search bar, type in the Fantasy Football Roundtable podcast. Give us a subscribe, give us a like.
These, that swooning comment coming probably from 2 guys that chose to spend their vacation in really hot places on the East Coast. So, we'll be back later this week looking at the NFC West. Until then, have a wonderful week.
When you say really hot places, you mean like